Does America really have a godly heritage? Indeed it does. Abundant documentary evidence of that fact is available in tens of thousands of historic documents. In fact, the history in and around just this one building clearly demonstrates America's godly heritage. This is Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the birthplace of American liberty and the cradle of American constitutional government. It was here on July the 2nd, 1776, that our founding fathers in the Continental Congress approved a complete separation from Great Britain. It was 2 days later, on the 4th of July, that they approved the Declaration of Independence, and then 4 days after that, on the 8th of July, they took that new declaration, they walked outside, they stood on the steps of Independence Hall, and they read that new declaration to the crowd that was assembled around the building. They then rang this bell, the famous Liberty Bell. Now, most folks assume that this is called the Liberty Bell because it rang when America announces liberty, but that's not the case. It's called the Liberty Bell because of the Bible verse from Leviticus 25:10 that's emblazoned around the top of the bell.
Proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof.
This Bible verse accurately describes what happened on July the 8th, 1776, when liberty was announced to the people and the Liberty Bell was rung to proclaim liberty throughout the land. Right around the corner from Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell is this building. This is Carpenter's Hall. This is the building in which the very first American Congress met, even 2 years before they declared independence. In 1774, as the 13 colonies saw the approaching conflict with Great Britain, 40 of America's leading statesmen gathered here in preparation for that coming conflict. Those 40 luminaries included individuals such as Patrick Henry, John Adams, George Washington, John Jay, Samuel Adams, and many others. Now, most of those 40 had never met each other before they gathered here, so when they assembled here for the first time, what'd they do? They opened with prayer, right here. But it was not a dinky little superficial type of prayer like might be prayed at a public gathering today. No, it was a profound time of prayer. It was led by the Reverend Jacob Duché, a nearby minister from local Christ Church just a couple blocks away. This is the Reverend Jacob Duché's church. This is Christ Church. This is the church where many of the founding fathers worshiped and where many of them are buried. In fact, there are 7 signers of the Declaration buried here, including Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, James Wilson, Robert Morris, and Francis Hopkinson. And signers George Ross and Joseph Hughes are also buried here. So many founders worshiped here at Christ Church that around 1910, a famous stained glass window, now called Patriot's Window, was added to the church, showing many of the founders and famous Americans who attended here. Shown in the window are Robert Morris and his family. Robert Morris was one of the elite group of 6 founding fathers who signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. There's also George Washington and his wife, Martha. And Alexander Hamilton, a signer of the Constitution and an author of the Federalist Papers. And Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration and the father of public schools under the Constitution. And here is Joseph Hopkinson, a federal judge and a constitutional attorney who was the son of signer of the Declaration, Francis Hopkinson. In fact, here is signer Francis Hopkinson with another of his sons. And this is John Penn and his family. And this is Benjamin Franklin and his daughter Sarah. Franklin is another of the 6 who signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. He was also governor of Pennsylvania after the Revolution. Not only did Franklin attend church here, but this is pew number 70, which Benjamin Franklin held in this church for 60 years. This is the pew where he and his family sat when attending church here. And this is pew number 58, where George and Martha Washington sat while attending church during the 7 years that he resided in Philadelphia as President of the United States. This is pew number 52, where Robert Morris sat during services. Pew number 60 is where John Penn sat. And pew number 65 is the pew of Francis Hopkinson, who played the organ here in this church and is responsible for this work from 1767. This is America's first purely American hymn book. It was from Christ Church that the Reverend Jacob Duché came here to Carpenter's Hall to open the very first American Congress with prayer. Of that time of prayer, John Adams reported,
"The Reverend Duché, unexpectedly to everybody, struck out into an extemporary prayer which filled the bosom of every man present. I must confess I never heard a better prayer, with such fervor, such ardor, such earnestness and pathos, and in language so elegant and sublime for America and for the Congress. It has had an excellent effect upon everybody here.
Silas Deane, who became a famous American diplomat, was also a member of that first Congress, and he said that it was, quote,
a prayer worth riding 100 miles to hear.
That is, it was worth spending 3 days on horseback to arrive in time for that prayer. So profound was the prayer that Deane reported, quote,
even Quakers shed tears.
In addition to the momentous time of prayer that morning, Congress also read from 4 chapters in the Bible. One of those chapters, Psalm 35, had particularly impacted the group. As John Adams reported to his wife Abigail,
I never saw a greater effect upon an audience. It seemed as if heaven had ordained that psalm to be read on the morning. I must beg you to read that psalm.
Numerous other delegates also commented on that profound time of prayer and Bible study here at Carpenter's Hall, which is yet another clear reminder of America's godly heritage. After that first year when Congress met in Carpenter's Hall, the next year they met here in Independence Hall. This is the room that for several years was the home of the Continental Congress, the Congress that produced so many of our famous founding fathers and great national leaders and military generals and U.S. presidents. In fact, America's first 4 presidents all served in Congress in this room. An interesting anecdote involving one of those 4 occurred here in 1777. John Adams of Massachusetts, who went on to become America's 2nd president, became close friends with Dr. Benjamin Rush from here in Philadelphia while both were serving here in Congress during the Revolution. Both had signed the Declaration of Independence together. Dr. Rush, known as the father of American medicine, had been appointed by Congress as the Surgeon General of the Continental Army. In 1777, he traveled the battlefield hospitals, helping the wounded and checking on the medical conditions before returning to Congress. In 1777, the American Revolution was not going particularly well. America was losing many more battles than it was winning. At this time, with the outlook so bleak and the war going so poorly, Dr. Rush returned to Congress and in this room leaned over to John Adams and asked him if he thought that we could actually win the revolution. Adams' answer was clear and unequivocal. He simply replied,
Yes, if we fear God and repent of our sins.
Most Americans have never heard this account, but it's another part of our godly heritage, and it's characteristic of the tone so often manifested by Congress in this room. In fact, the Continental Congress issued 15 separate prayer proclamations during the Revolution, calling the country to days of prayer and fasting, or prayer and thanksgiving, depending on the specific circumstances at that time. In fact, here are 3 of those original prayer proclamations. These are 3 of the 15, and these and the others were characterized by explicitly Christian language. And recall John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress who presided over Congress in this very room? He signed the Declaration of Independence with his big, bold signature. He went on to become the first governor of Massachusetts. And here is a prayer proclamation that he issued. Notice that this is for a day of public humiliation, fasting, and prayer, and is characterized by explicitly Christian language. Hancock issued nearly 24 such proclamations. Calls to prayer, including the many calls issued by the Continental Congress in this room, were a frequent occurrence during the American Revolution. But this is another part of America's godly heritage of which few Americans today have ever heard. Just as the Declaration of Independence was approved and signed in this room in 1776, so too, 11 years later in 1787, the U.S. Constitution was written and signed in this room. But few today know that virtually every one of the 55 founding fathers who framed the U.S. Constitution were members of Orthodox Christian churches, and many were outspoken evangelical Christians. Few today know that of the 56 founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence in this room, nearly half had received degrees from schools that today would be considered seminaries or Bible schools. Few today know that it was signers of the Declaration of Independence who started the Sunday school movement, as well as numerous Bible societies and missionary societies. And signers of the Declaration were also responsible for penning numerous religious works and publishing several famous Bibles, including this one, America's very first family Bible, and also this one. This is the first translation of the Greek Septuagint into English. And then there is this one. This is the first stereotyped or mass-produced Bible in America, and all of them were done by signers of the Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, This Bible from 1782 is an important part of the history of this very room in Independence Hall. Before the Revolution, when we were still British citizens, it had been illegal to print English language Bibles here in America. We used only those Bibles that the King approved. But with the final American victory over the British at Yorktown, we were finally free of that policy. Robert Aiken, a local printer, therefore approached Congress asking permission to print English language Bibles on his presses here in Philadelphia. He pointed out to Congress that the Bible would be, quote,
a neat edition of the Holy Scriptures for the use of schools.
Congress approved his request and appointed a congressional committee to oversee the project. In late summer 1782, the committee reported back to Congress that the Bible was ready to print. And so, on September the 12th, 1782, Congress, in this room, officially approved that Bible. It soon began rolling off the presses, and this is the final product. Originally, some 20,000 of these Bibles were printed, but today only about 30 are left in existence. This is now one of the rarest books in the world. This is the first English language Bible ever printed in America, and in the front of this Bible is a congressional endorsement declaring,
whereupon resolved that the United States in Congress assembled recommend this edition of the Bible to the inhabitants of the United States.
This famous Bible for the use of our schools is the product of the action of Congress in this very room. Concerning this specific event and the Bible it produced, one early historian observed,
who, in view of this fact, will call in question the assertion that this is a Bible nation? Who will charge the government with indifference to religion when the first Congress of the states assumed all the rights and performed all the duties of a Bible society long before such an institution had an existence in the world?
Indeed. Congress itself was America's very first Bible society. These are just a few of the many examples of America's rich, godly heritage. Another well-documented part of America's godly heritage that few know today involves George Washington. Significantly, George Washington served in this room as a member of the Continental Congress in 1775. And it was here that he was chosen to become the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. 12 years later, in 1787, he served in this room again as President of the Constitutional Convention, presiding over the writing of the U.S. Constitution. These facts are well known. However, there's a long famous but now forgotten account of the young George Washington that appeared in school textbooks for generations. It involves a military battle in which George Washington's life hung in the balance for over 2 hours, but was miraculously spared. In fact, Washington himself openly acknowledged that it was only by the direct intervention of God that he had remained alive. The incident transpired in America's French and Indian War, which occurred in the 1750s, some 20 years before the American Revolution. At that time, both England and France, two long-standing bitter enemies that had fought each other for centuries in Europe, they were both claiming the same land in America along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. They went to war to settle that dispute, and those living in America at the time took sides, with most of the Indians joining with the French and most of the American colonists joining with the British. Great Britain, seeking to drive the French from the inland parts of America, dispatched some 2,000 hand-picked veteran British troops to the colonies. Those troops, under the command of distinguished General Edward Braddock, arrived in Virginia and were joined by 100 Virginia buckskins led by their 23-year-old Colonel George Washington. Braddock then set out for the mouth of the Ohio River to expel the French from Fort Duquesne, which is now the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Having traveled hundreds of miles, Braddock arrived here in western Maryland, where he temporarily halted the troops and constructed Fort Cumberland on the very location where this church now sits. Even though he was still more than 100 miles from Fort Duquesne, Fort Cumberland would serve as a staging ground for the attack. Fort Cumberland no longer exists today, But this is Fort Necessity, which was built by George Washington the year before Braddock came to America, when George Washington had led Virginia's military forces in an unsuccessful attack against the French at Fort Duquesne. Well, even though Fort Cumberland no longer exists, this gives you a good idea of how it would have appeared at the time. From Fort Cumberland, Braddock dispatched his force in several ways. First, he sent out 700 as an engineering force with axemen and military protection to open a road through the wilderness. Next came Braddock, George Washington, the Virginians, and 1,200 chosen British troops. This was the principal military force. Last came the baggage and heavy equipment wagons, bringing up the rear with some 400 soldiers. Several weeks later, on July the 9th, 1755, Braddock's forces had reached this very point. This is now Braddock, Pennsylvania, but it was only 7 miles from the French fort. While following a pathway through these woods, they walked into a waiting ambush. Right here, the French and the Indians opened fire on them from both sides. But not to worry.
Forward line of battle!
Braddock's troops were battle-hardened British veterans. They were accustomed to war. Unfortunately, they were veterans of European wars. And in Europe, warfare was traditionally conducted on an open battlefield. One army lined up at one end of the open field, the other army lined up at the other end of the open field. They looked at each other, they took aim, and they fired. No running, no hiding. Everyone stayed in the open. When the 700 troops in that advance party came under attack, they turned and fled and ran directly into the 1,200 troops behind them that were still advancing, created mass confusion, and it ended up that most of the battle took place right here in these woods. From these trees, the Indians were shooting down on the British. From behind these rocks, they were shooting at the British. From under logs, they were shooting at the British. The British had no clue what to do. In fact, when they came under fire in the ambush, they did exactly what they'd been trained to do. They didn't run, they didn't seek shelter, they simply lined up shoulder to shoulder along the bottom of the ravine, and they were promptly slaughtered. In fact, over the next 2 hours, of the 1,300 British and American troops, 714, more than half of them, were shot down. Only 30 of the French and Indians were shot, and most of those were by Washington's Virginia buckskins, who were accustomed to woodland warfare and who had taken cover when the attack began. Even among the officers, the British losses had been enormous. Of the 86 British and American officers in that battle, 26 were killed and 36 more wounded. George Washington was the only mounted officer not shot down off his horse. He was the only remaining officer left on horseback. And he had been particularly vulnerable because throughout the battle, he had courageously ridden back and forth along the front line of the troops, delivering General Braddock's orders first here and then there. Late in the battle, General Braddock was seriously wounded. Washington took charge, gathered the remaining troops, and led them back to Fort Cumberland. Along the way, Braddock died. And on his death, in the ambush, they did exactly what they'd been trained to do. They didn't run, they didn't seek shelter, they simply lined up shoulder to shoulder along the bottom of the ravine, and they were promptly slaughtered. In fact, over the next 2 hours, of the 1,300 British and American troops, 714, more than half of them, were shot down. Only 30 of the French and Indians were shot, and most of those were by Washington's Virginia buckskins, who were accustomed to woodland warfare and who had taken cover when the attack began. Even among the officers, the British losses had been enormous. Of the 86 British and American officers in that battle, 26 were killed and 36 more wounded. George Washington was the only mounted officer not shot down off his horse. He was the only remaining officer left on horseback. And he had been particularly vulnerable because throughout the battle, he had courageously ridden back and forth along the front line of the troops, delivering General Braddock's orders first here and then there. Late in the battle, General Braddock was seriously wounded. Washington took charge, gathered the remaining troops, and led them back to Fort Cumberland. Along the way, Braddock died. And on his death, Washington performed the role of military chaplain, reading the funeral service, offering prayers, and reading scriptures. Braddock's body was then buried here, and wagons were driven over his grave so that the Indians could not find his body and desecrate his remains. Washington and the remaining troops arrived back at Fort Cumberland on July the 17th, 1755. During the week-long march back to the fort, word had spread across the colonies that the slaughter of the British and American forces had been complete, that the entire force had been wiped out. So after his safe arrival at the fort, Washington wrote a letter to his family assuring them that despite the reports to the contrary, he was still very much alive. He told them,
"As I have heard since my arrival at this place a circumstantial account of my death and dying speech, I take this early opportunity of contradicting both, and of assuring you that I now exist and appear in the land of the living."
Washington assured his family that he was indeed alive, but just barely. He explained that after the battle was over, he had taken off his jacket and had found 4 bullet holes through it, yet not a single bullet had touched him. And he had horses shot from under him, but he had not been scratched. Washington therefore told them,
"I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of Providence that protected me beyond all human expectation."
As word of God's protection of Washington spread across the colonies, the Reverend Samuel Davies even mentioned it in this sermon, preached just a few weeks after the battle. By the way, Davies was a leader in the American revival known as the Great Awakening, and he was considered the greatest pulpit preacher in America. In this 1755 sermon, the Reverend Davies expressed his belief that God's special intervention in behalf of Washington during that battle suggested that God probably had something special planned for Washington in the future. Of course, 20 years later, it was apparent that God definitely did have something special planned for George Washington, and the entire nation has benefited as a result. Additional evidence of God's miraculous and direct intervention in that 1755 battle was provided 15 years later in 1770, which was then the time of peace. George Washington returned to the area near where he had earlier battled the French and Indians. An old Indian chief from far away, having learned of Washington's return, traveled across the state to meet with Washington. The ancient leather-faced chief sat down with Washington and face-to-face over a council fire explained that he had been a leader in that battle 15 years earlier, and that during the battle he had instructed his braves to single out the officers and shoot them down, knowing that if he could slaughter the officers, they could scatter the remaining troops and then easily destroy them later. Washington, like the other officers, had been specifically singled out, but after dozens of unsuccessful attempts by the warriors to shoot him down, the chief concluded that Washington was under the care of the Great Spirit, and he instructed his braves to cease firing at him. He told Washington,
"I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle."
Significantly, others from that battle provided identical testimony. For example, another chief testified,
Washington was never born to be killed by a bullet. I had 17 fair fires at him with my rifle, and after all could not bring him to the ground.
Clearly, God's intervention in the preservation of George Washington was apparent both to his foes as well as to his friends. Today, a huge memorial to George Washington has been erected to commemorate the site of that battle. What would have been the impact on America had Washington been shot down in 1755? Nearly 2 centuries later, President Calvin Coolidge answered that question, declaring,
Washington was the directing spirit without which there would have been no independence, no union, no constitution, and no republic. We cannot yet estimate him. We can only indicate our reverence for him and thank the divine providence which kept him to serve and inspire his fellow man.
Significantly, even Washington understood that he had played a critical role in America's formation, but he also recognized that it had not been the result of his own skills, but rather the favor of God. As he humbly acknowledged,
"I have only been an instrument in the hands of Providence."
the remarkable account of God's direct intervention in the life and affairs of one of our greatest national heroes appeared in American history textbooks for nearly a century and a half. It's a well-documented part of our godly heritage, but today, this account is virtually unknown. In fact, today we're often told just the opposite, that America had no godly heritage, and that our founding fathers were atheists and agnostics and deists who formed a completely secular government. However, a clear declaration by founding father John Adams proves otherwise. John Adams declared,
The general principles on which the Fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity.
That declaration by John Adams is exactly the opposite of what we hear today. Yet Adams was an eyewitness. He knew what our foundation was. In fact, he helped construct it. There's abundant evidence proving that the general principles of Christianity were indeed firmly embraced by the vast majority of our founding fathers, and that those principles form the foundation of American government. In addition to the proof that's readily available in the founders' own writings and public acts, additional confirmation is also found in what many today might consider a surprising source, the publications of the American Tract Society. Known for publishing gospel tracts and literature, the American Tract Society was formed in the early 1800s. In 1813, they bound their individual tracts together to make these volumes of gospel tracts. It's fascinating to read these old Bible tracts and the messages they contain, but it's even more fascinating to note that several of these gospel tracts were penned by founding fathers who drafted our founding documents. Yet considering the educational system and the textbooks that produced our great leaders, it's not surprising that so many of them were Christians and were outspoken about the importance of Christian principles in American government. Here's a prime example. One early textbook that had great influence was the New England Primer. First introduced in Boston in 1690, this was a school book from which Americans learned to read until 1930. It was a beginning textbook in education, or what we today would call a first grade textbook. Not only were many of the founding fathers raised on this textbook, but they even reprinted it to make sure that it was available for children in their generation. Samuel Adams reprinted the Primer for students in Massachusetts. Benjamin Franklin reprinted it for students in Pennsylvania, and Noah Webster reprinted it for students in Connecticut. What did it contain? Well, after introducing students to the alphabet, it presented a special section to be memorized, a section in which each letter of the alphabet was accompanied by a Bible verse. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. Proverbs 10:1. B, better is a little with fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. Proverbs 15:16. C, come unto Christ, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and he will give you rest. Matthew 11:28. And on it continues. And this alphabet was memorized by American students for over 2 centuries. And in the back of this little book were more than 100 questions for students, including, what's the 5th commandment? What's forbidden in the 5th commandment? What's required in the 6th commandment? What's forbidden in the 6th commandment? There were dozens of similar Bible-oriented questions, and this textbook was a foundation in American public education for over 2 centuries. Students educated under this philosophy, so inculcated with biblical principles, were frequently characterized by what many today would consider exceptional achievements at a very young age. For example, during the American Revolution, when John Quincy Adams was only 11 years old, he was assigned to be the official secretary to his father, John Adams, America's ambassador to the British court of St. James. And at the tender age of 14, John Quincy Adams was appointed to be the official diplomatic secretary to Francis Dana, America's ambassador to Russia. Can you imagine sending a 14-year-old today to help represent the United States in Russia? John Quincy Adams clearly began his service for America while very young, and his distinguished political career spanned nearly 7 decades. Following his service in the American Revolution, he served as a foreign ambassador under Presidents George Washington, John Adams, and James Madison. In fact, George Washington called him
the most valuable public character we have abroad.
John Quincy Adams was also a U.S. Senator under President Thomas Jefferson. He was Secretary of State under President James Monroe, and then he became the nation's 6th president. He finished his career with an additional 17 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is an address that a very elderly John Quincy Adams delivered on the 4th of July in 1837, 61 years after the Declaration had been signed. Having been an eyewitness and a participant in the birth of America, he had been selected as a keynote speaker at a large patriotic celebration where he delivered this address. Adams began by asking the crowd a simple question.
Why is it that, next to the birthday of the Savior of the world, your most joyous and most venerated festival returns on this day, on the 4th of July?
An interesting question. Why is it that the 4th of July and Christmas were America's top 2 holidays? John Quincy Adams answered that question.
Is it not that in the chain of human events, the birthday of the nation is indissolubly linked with the birthday of the Savior? That it forms a leading event in the progress of the gospel dispensation? Is it not that the Declaration of Independence first organized the social compact on the foundation of the Redeemer's mission upon earth? That it laid the cornerstone of human government upon the first precepts of Christianity?
According to John Quincy Adams, on the 4th of July, 1776, the Founding Fathers had taken the principles that came into the world through the birth of Christ and used those principles to birth the nation, thus joining together Christian principles and civil government in what he called an indissoluble bond. Today, however, we're told just the opposite. We're told that the Founders didn't want an indissoluble bond, but that instead they wanted a so-called separation, that they wanted biblical principles kept out of civil government. But that's not what Adams said, and he was an eyewitness to the American Revolution and served during the American founding. He knew what he'd seen and what he and the other founders had done. And other founders were equally outspoken about the importance of maintaining Christian principles in, not out of the civil arena. Consider, for example, John Jay. John Jay served in Independence Hall as the president of the Continental Congress in 1778. He was also one of 3 founding fathers who drafted and signed the peace treaty with Great Britain to end the American Revolution and establish America as an independent nation. Once the U.S. Constitution was written, Jay was an author of the Federalist Papers. He's considered one of the 3 men most responsible for the adoption of the Constitution. And when George Washington became president, Jay served first as his first Secretary of State and then was appointed as the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. In fact, when the Federal Congress sat here in Philadelphia before moving to its permanent home in Washington, D.C., John Jay was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when it met in this room, inside Old City Hall, the building located next door to Independence Hall. For almost a decade, this was a home of the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was in this very room that John Jay presided over the early United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Jay clearly believed that Christian principles should be included in the civil arena. In fact, here is a newspaper from 1792 documenting the fact that ministers came into the courtroom and opened the court with prayer and prayed over juries before they went out to consider the legal issues placed before them by John Jay or other of the justices. In fact, on this particular day, the Reverend Dr. Parker offered the prayer, and Vice President John Adams was in attendance, present for that day's prayer and John Jay's charge to the jury. Clearly, John Jay did not want religious principles or expressions separated from the public arena. In fact, he forcefully declared,
Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers.
President George Washington also urged the incorporation of religious principles throughout the public arena. This book is an original from 1796. This is his famous farewell address in which he announced to Congress and the nation that he was retiring from public office after serving 2 terms as president. By the way, of the 8 years that Washington was president, for 7 of them, he lived just outside Independence Hall in what was called the President's House, and he was living there when he delivered this address. In its original handwritten format, the address was delivered to Congress while they still met here in Philadelphia. That address was promptly published in newspapers across the nation, such as this one from September the 21st, 1796. For generations, Washington's farewell address was considered so important and its content so profound, it appeared in this format as a separate standalone textbook. Students were taught that this address was the most significant political speech ever delivered to the nation, and they were even tested on its content. Yet in recent decades, Washington's farewell address has largely disappeared from American textbooks. Why? Apparently it has way too much religious content for today's often secular-minded educrats. How religious is Washington's farewell address? Well, in explaining why the American political system had been so successful, Washington specifically singled out what he considered to be the 2 most important elements of American government.
Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars.
Washington specifically identified religion and morality as the two most important elements of American government. And he even warned that anyone who attempted to separate those two elements from the political realm could not be considered an American patriot. We certainly don't hear those types of statements anymore, but such were the succinct declarations of America's founders. Clearly, the system of government given to us by our founding fathers was deliberately and intentionally built upon religion and morality, and it has enjoyed unprecedented success. We are now the world's longest ongoing constitutional republic. To exist more than 2 centuries under the same governing document is an accomplishment unknown among contemporary nations. For example, Russia, Italy, France, Greece, Haiti, and many other nations underwent revolutions at about the same time as the American Revolution, but with very different results. In fact, during the same period that America has had just one government, France has had 15. And in just the 20th century alone, Russia had 4, Afghanistan 5, Poland 7, and the same pattern is true with other nations. Each of those nations, when forming their governments, had access to the same set of political philosophies. Yet our founding fathers apparently selected ideas that the other nations chose not to apply. So what were the sources for the founders' successful ideas? Political science professors believe that they could answer this question. If they could assemble a broad spectrum of writings from the founding era and see who or what was being quoted in those writings, then they could identify the source for many of the unique political ideas embraced during the founding era. The researchers therefore assembled 15,000 representative writings from that period, searched those writings, and isolated 3,154 direct quotes. They traced those quotes back to their original sources, thereby identifying the most frequently cited sources of the founding era. The result is recorded here in this work, The Origins of American Constitutionalism. The researchers discovered that the single individual cited most often during the founding era was political philosopher Charles Montesquieu, with 8.3% of the quotes being taken from his writings from the 1750s. Legal scholar William Blackstone was the second most cited individual, with 7.9% of the quotes being taken from his writings in the 1760s. And political philosopher and theologian John Locke was third, with 2.9% of the quotes being taken from his writings in the 1680s and 1690s. These were the 3 most frequently cited individuals during the founding era. But the researchers discovered that the single most cited source was the Bible, with 34% of the quotes being taken from the Scriptures. Significantly, that percentage is even higher when the source of the ideas used by individuals such as Montesquieu and Blackstone and Locke are identified and included. Consider, for example, a primary source of Blackstone's ideas. This massive set is Blackstone's most famous work, his Commentaries on the Laws. First introduced in 1766, this became the final word in American courts, and it remained a primary legal source until well into the 20th century. This was used to define words, establish procedure, and settle disputes. So what was the primary source for Blackstone's ideas? The answer is evident when going through his works, but the testimony of Charles Finney also provides a clear indication. Finney, a university president, educator, and civil rights leader, was probably best known for being a famous preacher during one of America's great revivals, the Second Great Awakening of the early 1800s. In his autobiography, Finney recounted his early desire to become an attorney. So like all other law students at that time, he began studying Blackstone's commentaries. As Blackstone covered the various legal concepts, he frequently presented the biblical ideas on which the laws were based. Finney stated that in the process of studying Blackstone, he read so much of the Bible that he became a Christian and received his call to the ministry. Clearly, a major source of Blackstone's ideas was the Bible, and a survey of the writings of Montesquieu and Locke confirms a similar and sometimes even a stronger biblical influence on their writings. So while 34% of the quotes in the representative writings of the founding era came directly from the Bible, many of the other quotes were taken from writers who, like Blackstone, had used the Bible to help arrive at their own conclusions, the Bible was far and away the most influential source of ideas in the founding era. It is therefore not surprising that the Constitution reflects many biblical principles. For example, Isaiah 33:22 sets forth 3 distinct branches of government, just as was adopted in the Constitution. And the logic for the separation of powers was based on teachings derived from Jeremiah 17:9, and the basis of tax exemptions for churches. Exemptions given us by the Founding Fathers themselves can be found in Ezra 7:24, and there are many other examples of American government adopting biblical patterns and precedents. In fact, the biblical underpinnings of America were so obvious to previous generations that in 1892, even the U.S. Supreme Court had no difficulty in rendering a unanimous decision with what may be a surprising declaration for us today.
No purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or national, because this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation.
This is a Christian nation. What would lead the U.S. Supreme Court to conclude that? The answer is simple: America's own history. The court's decision in that case was only 16 pages long, but in those 16 pages, the court provided almost 80 different historical precedents proving that America was indeed a Christian nation. The court referenced the Founding Fathers, the acts of Congress and the state governments, previous court decisions, and many other official actions to reach its conclusion that America was indeed a Christian nation. 80 precedents in a case is impressive, but it's also important because courts base their decisions on precedent. This enables them to be consistent from ruling to ruling, thus contributing to a stable society. Significantly, that 1892 court decision was by no means the only Supreme Court decision that recognized and preserved America's biblical heritage. Similar decisions were rendered both before and after that 1892 ruling. For example, in 1844, a case was brought before the Supreme Court involving this Philadelphia school. Originally founded by a wealthy French immigrant, he wanted it operated on the secular philosophy dominant in France during the French Enlightenment, and the same philosophy embraced by many schools today. Run by the city of Philadelphia, this school operated on the notion that students could successfully learn morality apart from the Bible. In fact, the school even adopted a policy prohibiting Christian ministers from setting foot on campus. This policy, perceived as an attempt to keep the Bible from students, became an issue at the U.S. Supreme Court. And when the court issued its final decision, the ruling was unanimous and was delivered by Justice Joseph Story, called a father of American jurisprudence, who was placed on the court by President James Madison. In that unanimous decision, the Supreme Court made this declaration that's very surprising today.
Why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as divine revelation in the schools? Its general precepts expounded, its evidences explained, and its glorious principles of morality inculcated. Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly, so perfectly, as from the New Testament?
The Supreme Court of the United States unanimously held that this government-run school should teach the Bible, the source of what it called, quote, the purest principles of morality. Modern rulings are exactly the opposite, but few today realize that earlier courts whose justices were appointed by Founding Fathers, have already ruled on the same issues. There are literally dozens of such rulings, including one by the 1811 New York Supreme Court, a ruling subsequently cited by the U.S. Supreme Court as an authority for its own decisions. That New York case dealt with a man who had distributed a writing full of vulgar, malicious, and gratuitous profanity, attacking God, Jesus Christ, and the Bible. He was fined and punished, and on appeal, the state Supreme Court upheld the conviction, stressing,
whatever strikes at the root of Christianity tends manifestly to the dissolution of civil government.
According to the court, an attack on Christianity was an attack on the foundation of our country and its government, and the U.S. Supreme Court agreed. Significantly, none of these court decisions, or scores of others like them, was a problem with the First Amendment, because previous generations understood that the First Amendment was never intended to separate biblical principles or expressions from the public square. Today, we so often hear the Constitution's religion clauses in the First Amendment coupled with the phrase separation of church and state. Yet concerning religion, the First Amendment only states,
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Clearly, neither the word separation, nor church, nor state is found in any part of the First Amendment. In fact, that phrase appears in no governmental founding document. Of course, most today recognize the phrase separation of church and state, but few know its source. Yet it is important to understand the origins of that phrase and how it subsequently became somehow attached to the First Amendment. Significantly, the 90 founding fathers who framed the First Amendment expressed a very clear intent for that amendment, an intent recorded here in the records of Congress. The debates surrounding the framing of the First Amendment ran from June the 7th through September the 25th of 1789, and the records of those debates make unequivocally clear that the First Amendment's purpose was to limit the federal government in two specific areas. First, the federal government was prohibited from establishing a national denomination, whether Catholic, Anglican, or any other. This was the very problem that America had faced when she was part of Great Britain. The British government could decree an official denomination to which all citizens must belong and then punish those who refused. The founders did not want that in America. The part of the First Amendment that forbids any such national denomination is called the Establishment Clause, and it is the part stating, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Secondly, the First Amendment also prohibited the federal government from interfering with or limiting the people's religious expressions. This part of the First Amendment is called the Free Exercise Clause. It's the part stating, or prohibiting, the free exercise thereof. Through the Free Exercise Clause, the federal government was required to protect and not suppress, as it currently does, public religious expressions. In short, because of the Free Exercise Clause, the federal government could not prohibit the people's free exercise of religion, whether expressed privately or publicly. Significantly, both religion clauses of the First Amendment were to limit the federal government and not the people. That is, first, the government could not establish any national religious conformity, and second, the government could not stop public religious expressions, but had to protect them. This is the extent of the First Amendment's religion clauses. And not only does the phrase separation of church and state not appear in any part of that amendment, but significantly, according to the official records of the entire debate on that amendment, the phrase separation of church and state never even came up during the months of discussions over that amendment. Not one single framer ever mentioned that phrase throughout the entire official discussion. It does seem that if separation of church and state had been their great intent for the First Amendment, somebody, one of those 90, surely would have said something about it. But no one did. Not a single word said about it. What then is the origin of the phrase separation of church and state that today so many consider? It's a phrase that appeared in a private letter penned by Thomas Jefferson 13 years after the First Amendment had been written. Throughout his life, Thomas Jefferson had proven himself to be a firm friend of religious liberty. In fact, before the Revolution, in his own state of Virginia, he had fought for freedom of public religious expression for Baptists, Quakers, Presbyterians, and others who were not part of the British state-established Anglican Church. In various colonies prior to the Revolution, non-Anglican ministers had actually been severely persecuted and even been put to death for preaching the gospel without permission of the state-established church. Therefore, founding fathers such as Jefferson, as well as Patrick Henry and James Madison and George Washington and George Mason and others, they fought for the rights of religious expression for all Christians, including the Baptists. They fought for this right before America separated from Great Britain, and they continued to do so afterwards. Years later, in 1801, Jefferson became the nation's third president. And not surprisingly, the Baptists were elated. After all, a man who had proven himself their champion at the state level was now the national leader. Jefferson received letters of congratulations from Baptist groups across the country, including one from the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, congratulating him on his victory, celebrating his election as president, and offering their prayers for him. However, they also expressed their concern that the government might restrict their public religious expressions. They believed that freedom of religion was a God-given inalienable right and that the government should be powerless to restrict religious activities unless, as they explained, those activities caused someone to, quote, work ill to his neighbor. That is, unless someone's religious expression actually directly harms someone else. Jefferson understood their concern, for he had already proven that it was his concern as well. He replied to the Danbury Baptists on January the 1st, 1802, thanking them for their kind prayers and assuring them that their free exercise of religion was indeed an inalienable right and therefore would not be meddled with by the government. Jefferson pointed out to them that there was, quote, a wall of separation between church and state, and that this wall of separation would prevent the government from interfering with or hindering religious activities. Jefferson, like the other founders, fully understood that the purpose of the First Amendment was to protect rather than prevent public religious expressions, and that this is what separation of church and state meant. In fact, for letter, there was no misunderstanding either about the purpose of the First Amendment or the meaning of Jefferson's phrase. Here's an example. In 1853, half a century after Jefferson had written that phrase, a group petitioned Congress urging them to separate Christian principles from government, with chaplains being turned out of Congress and the military, and Christian principles being removed from government in the official public square. They desired a so-called separation of church and state, but in the wrong direction. That is, instead of the government protecting religious expressions in the public arena because of separation, they wanted the government to remove religious expressions. Congress spent a year investigating that possibility and then emphatically rejected it, declaring,
had the people, the founding fathers during the Revolution, had a suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, but not any one denomination. In this age, there is no substitute for Christianity. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants.
in short, there was no way Congress was going to use the First Amendment and consequently its so-called separation of church and state to secularize the public square. As they clearly affirmed, the intent of the framers had been just the opposite. In fact, 2 years later, Congress reiterated,
the great vital and conservative element in our system, that is, the thing that holds our system together, is the belief of our people in the pure doctrines and divine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
That was Congress. Congress clearly refused to separate Christian principles from the public arena. However, it was not just Congress that refused to do so. The Supreme Court refused to do so as well. In an 1878 case, more than 3/4 of a century after Jefferson had penned his separation letter, the plaintiffs in that case invoked his separation of church and state phrase, hoping to use it to their advantage. However, that Supreme Court was not content to let them get by with just using the 8-word separation phrase out of context from Jefferson's letter, which, by the way, is what courts today do. No, rather than just cite the single phrase, the Supreme Court reprinted a lengthy segment from Jefferson's letter to prove that separation of church and state was intended to protect rather than remove Christian values and practices from public policy. The courts maintained that position for the next 7 decades. Then, in 1947, a radical change occurred. In the case Everson versus Board of Education, the court cited only Jefferson's separation metaphor, ignoring the rest of his letter and its clear context. It therefore boldly announced a new policy.
The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach.
This was a brand new philosophy for the court. No longer would Jefferson's separation phrase protect public religious expressions, as it had for the previous century and a half. It would now become a mandate to exclude religious expressions and to secularize the public square. Significantly, as courts and secularists began to remove public religious expressions, they simultaneously clamored separation of church and state, claiming this is what the founders wanted. This was their great intent. So often have they repeated the separation phrase when talking about the First Amendment that many citizens today now believe that the phrase is actually part of the First Amendment, thus demonstrating the truth of a statement attributed to Dr. William James, the father of modern psychology.
There is nothing so absurd, but if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it.
Today's courts, in dealing with First Amendment issues, now repeat the separation phrase more often than they do the First Amendment itself. In fact, since 1947, the separation phrase has been cited in over 4,000 court cases, but the First Amendment's been cited in less than 3,000. In short, the courts have now elevated a single phrase from a private letter, a phrase completely reversed from its original meaning, above the actual language of the First Amendment itself. The Supreme Court, having announced its new approach in 1947, first nationally implemented the policy of public secularism in 1962 when, for the first time in American history, it ordered the separation of religious principles from education, ruling that it was unconstitutional for a student to pray voluntarily, to say a voluntary prayer at school. So revolutionary was this decision that the following year, even the court itself acknowledged that this decision had been without precedent. However, the court's hostility toward voluntary prayer did not stop with that first decision. No, the courts continued to push the prohibition wider and wider and wider until, by 1985, the Supreme Court had even declared that it was unconstitutional for a student to pray a silent voluntary prayer at school. Now, frankly, I don't know how they know if someone is praying silently. I mean, after all, many silent prayers occur with heads lifted and eyes open. So how does the court know when to enforce the ban on silent prayer? Nevertheless, the hostility was such that the U.S. Supreme Court even declared that permitting silent voluntary student prayer was unconstitutional. In the landmark 1962 case, the court achieved its reversal of the Constitution's protection for religious expressions first by using the phrase separation of church and state without regard to its historical meaning, and then by redefining the meaning of a single word within the separation phrase, the word church. For nearly 2 centuries prior to that case, the word church in the phrase separation of church and state was defined to mean a federally established national denomination, such as was represented by the Baptists or Catholics or Anglicans or Presbyterians or whatever. However, in 1962, the court decided that the word church would no longer mean a religious institution, it would now mean a religious activity. So instead of the First Amendment being used to prevent the federal government from setting up a national denomination, which voluntary prayer certainly did not do, it now meant that the federal government must not allow a public religious activity, which voluntary prayer certainly was. This was the turning point in the modern interpretation of the First Amendment. And since that time, notice how that virtually every possible genre of traditional religious expression has been forbidden in recent years under this new doctrine. Imagine, for just short of 2 centuries, the First Amendment had prohibited the federal government from halting public religious exercises. But now, somehow, the First Amendment means just the opposite, all because the court took an 8-word phrase from a private letter and twisted and completely reversed its meaning, and then made that phrase a replacement for the clear wording of the Constitution. That 1962 case redefined the First Amendment, and it's notable for other reasons as well, particularly for its use, or lack thereof, of precedents. Recall that when the 1892 Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Christian principles must remain the basis of American laws and institutions, it had offered nearly 80 precedents as a basis for that decision. The 1962 case was just the opposite, providing virtually no precedents to support its removal of voluntary school prayer. The justices on the court were simply ready to move America in a new direction. So in essence, they simply announced, "We'll not have voluntary prayer in schools anymore. We now think that that violates the Constitution." Within 12 months of that original decision, in 2 additional cases, the court reaffirmed its removal of voluntary prayer and then broadened its prohibition to include Bible reading at school. This was an even more radical reversal than the removal of voluntary prayer. Recall from the brief historical survey already presented that the founders relied on the Bible in education. Early textbooks quoted the Bible and used it to help students memorize the alphabet. Congress printed the first English language Bible for the use of our schools, and previous Supreme Courts ruled that government-run schools would teach the Bible. So, when the court banned Bible reading from schools in 1963, on what possible grounds did it justify its decision? If you want to see why the court did what it did, simply read the case for yourself. You can find it online, or you can go to a local law library and read it. And if you do, you'll see that in reaching its decision, the lower court had relied on the testimony of a psychologist who explained the danger of reading the Bible in schools. The Supreme Court then repeated that finding, reporting,
"If portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child."
That's quite a statement. The court was no longer concerned merely about law and the Constitution, its constitutionally assigned role, but it had now appointed itself as the national child psychologist. In fact, in recent years, justices on the court have described the court's role not only as being amateur psychologists on a, quote, psycho journey, but also as being, quote, a national theology board, and, quote, a super board of education for every school district in the nation. That decision to remove the Bible from schools, just like the decision to ban voluntary prayer, was a reversal of all previous practice and rulings by the court on that issue. The court was simply announcing yet another new policy. In essence, it was just saying, the majority of the 9 of us on the court don't want the Bible in schools anymore. Following those 2 landmark rulings, courts continued to expand the new secular mandates outward. For example, in 1967, a federal court declared a 4-line nursery rhyme used by a K-5 kindergarten class to be unconstitutional. The court acknowledged that the word God did not appear anywhere in the nursery rhyme, yet the rhyme was still unconstitutional. Apparently, if someone were to hear the rhyme, he might think that it was talking about God, and that would be unconstitutional. This trend of hostility toward religious expressions continued in case after case, year after year. In fact, by 1980, the Supreme Court even addressed whether students could continue voluntarily to see the 10 Commandments while at school. The court acknowledged that the 10 Commandments in question were passive displays, just one of many pictures at school. That is, a student might see hanging on the wall a picture of George Washington, or a field of flowers, or a lighthouse on a seashore, or student artwork, or the 10 Commandments, or whatever. In fact, here is an original copy of the 10 Commandments that led to the Supreme Court case. They were not part of any curriculum. They passively hung on the wall, and like any other picture, a student could look at them if he wanted to, and if he didn't, he just walked on by. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court ruled that allowing students even voluntarily to see a copy of the 10 Commandments at school was unconstitutional. The 10 Commandments had to come down off the walls. Notice the court's explanation.
If the posted copies of the 10 Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps to venerate and obey the commandments. This is not a permissible state objective.
What a statement. We can't let students see the 10 Commandments. If they saw them, they might read them. And if they read them, they might respect them. They might even obey them. You know, things like don't steal and don't kill. That would be unconstitutional. Significantly, generations of American leaders and courts before that ruling had regularly affirmed that the 10 Commandments were the basis of civilized behavior in our society and the foundation for much of our legal code. In fact, speaking about the 10 Commandments, John Adams unequivocally declared,
If thou shalt not covet and thou shalt not steal were not commandments of heaven, they must be made inviolable precepts in every society before it can be civilized or made free.
This was the clear declaration of John Adams. And by the way, I think he'd qualify as an expert on the First Amendment. After all, he personally oversaw its framing in the U.S. Senate, and his signature is one of only 2 that appears at the bottom of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. And he forcefully asserts that the 10 Commandments must be fundamental precepts of our civil society. Founding Father James Wilson also affirmed the importance of divine law, such as the 10 Commandments. James Wilson was the distinguished founding father who served many years in Independence Hall, signing both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, one of only 6 founders to sign both documents. He was then appointed by President George Washington as an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, where he served in the court for its first 9 years, including when it met here in this room next door to Independence Hall. Significantly, James Wilson was the founder of the first organized legal training in America. In fact, these law books contain the lectures he delivered to law students here in Philadelphia while simultaneously serving here as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. These are really the first American law school textbooks. James Wilson having helped write the Constitution and then taught students about it, would certainly know what is and is not constitutional. So did he think that divine laws such as the Ten Commandments, must be kept out of public view? Here's what he clearly explained to students.
Human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of that law which is divine. Far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters, friends, and mutual assistants. Indeed, these two sciences run into each other.
James Wilson certainly did not believe that the Ten Commandments or divine law should be kept from public view, and many other founders made similarly explicit statements. Furthermore, early courts issued literally dozens of rulings citing from the Ten Commandments as a legal authority on numbers of diverse issues. In fact, so clear was the civil recognition of America's reliance on the Ten Commandments that for decades one was more likely to find a copy of the Ten Commandments hanging in a government building than in a religious one. Yet despite this lengthy history of reliance on the Ten Commandments, the court suddenly held that students could no longer see the teachings that are the basis of our laws. Returning to the 1962 decision that initiated the official hostility toward public religious expressions, the entire controversy had begun over a 22-word voluntary prayer that the court struck down in the Engel Vital case. That little prayer, which led to the end of all school prayer and so many other public religious expressions, had simply stated,
Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country.
That little voluntary prayer, which only acknowledged God and didn't even mention the word Jesus, was so bland that 8 years later it was ascribed by a court as a, quote, to whom it may concern prayer. Now that's bland. That prayer acknowledged God only once, the same number of times that God is acknowledged in the Pledge of Allegiance, and only 1/4 the number of times He's acknowledged in the Declaration of Independence. Yet somehow, that single voluntary acknowledgement was unconstitutional. Since this prayer had merely acknowledged God, the court even went so far as to investigate what percentage of the nation at that time did believe in God. The court reported that only 3% professed no belief in religion, no belief in God. Significantly, 97% of the nation did believe. That 22-word prayer was consistent with the beliefs of nearly all the nation. Yet the court said that it was unconstitutional for students even voluntarily to say what almost the entire nation believed. This was another first by the court, in addition to 1, having ignored the actual wording of the Constitution, 2, having set aside precedent, and 3, then having elevated an 8-word phrase from a private letter above the Constitution itself. The court, having no constitutional basis and nothing more than its own preference, now, 4, sided with the 3% against the 97%. This was the first time in America's history that 3% had become the majority. This decision initiated the current policy whereby the philosophy of the small dissident group, that is the 3%, becomes the standard by which the rest of the nation, that is the 97%, must conduct its public affairs. In the unconstitutional 22-word prayer, there had been 4 categories over which God's blessings had been petitioned. 1, us, that is students. 2, parents, that is families. 3, teachers or schools. And 4, the country or the nation. Significantly, for almost 2 centuries, the courts had used biblical principles in addressing policy issues in all 4 of those areas. For example, in the area of families, courts noted that civil laws made divorce difficult to obtain because the Bible was difficult to obtain. And even 20th century courts pointed out that God, not government, had made marriage and the family. Therefore, government did not have a right to regulate something it hadn't made. Courts even set forth biblical lessons citing Adam and Eve and covering a history of God's dealings with marriage and the family, concluding that since it was God who had created marriage and the family, the court would use His standards in dealing with those areas. The courts similarly applied biblical principles to the other 3 categories as well. But in 1962-63, the Supreme Court reversed that practice. So, did the court's decision to change national policy and expunge God's principles from public affairs have any measurable effect? Statistics seem to indicate that it did, and in ways that the founders themselves had predicted. For example, consider the changes that occurred in the first category, us, that is, students. George Washington, in his farewell address, accurately predicted what would occur if religious principles were separated from students. He specifically warned,
"Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of impressionable structure, that is, on the minds of students, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle."
Washington warned that excluding religious principles from education and students would result in a loss of morality. Statistics now confirm the accuracy of his warning. Consider the category of pregnancies for unwed teenage girls. For decades prior to 1962-63, birth rates for unwed teen girls had remained relatively stable. But with the court's exclusion of religious principles from students, birth rates for unwed teenage girls immediately skyrocketed by 400%. Similarly, birth rates for junior high girls had also been low. But following the court's removal of religious principles, pregnancies for girls ages 10 through 14 shot up by 460%. America now has the highest teen pregnancy rate of any nation in the industrialized world. Sexually transmitted diseases among students also reached previously unrecorded highs. Notice how low the rates had been. Notice the point where religious principles were removed, and look at the dramatic increase that followed. Strikingly, moral measurements for students broke violently in the wrong direction following the court's 1962-63 policy of enforced secularism. This is a strong correlation. Perhaps it's merely coincidental, but it certainly is clear and striking. Consider the next category in which public policy long maintained the use of biblical principles, the category of our parents, that is, our families. What happened with the exclusion of biblical principles? Consider the area of marital stability. According to federal statistics, the divorce rate had been steadily declining for years and even decades prior to 1962-63. But then notice what happened. Religious principles were excluded from public policy and the divorce rate skyrocketed. Suddenly, the United States found itself #1 in the world in the divorce rate. Similarly, the number of single-parent families also exploded, reaching almost triple its previous level, and unmarried couples living together increased tenfold, soaring by over 1,000%. In fact, having now excluded biblical principles, some American policymakers even became confused about how to define something as simple as marriage. Was it to remain the union of a man and a woman, or should it become that of a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, or 5 men and a woman, or vice versa? Or is it perhaps an older man and an adolescent girl, or any of the other possible combinations? What remarkable changes have occurred since biblical values were excluded from public policies on the family. The third category over which God's assistance had been petitioned in that unconstitutional prayer was our teachers, that is, our schools. What happened when God and biblical principles were barred from our schools? One excellent indicator is the SAT test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, an academic test for college-bound high school students that has been used in America since 1926. Prior to 1962-63, SAT scores bounced around the same general level and had been stable for decades. But following the removal of God from education, scores plummeted year after year after year after year. Other school-related statistics showed similar adverse changes. Consider finally the fourth category, that of our country, or the nation. Just from a common sense perspective, what do you think will happen when a policy is adopted that says, you can't see the 10 Commandments, things like don't steal and don't kill? You might obey them. We can't have that. Logic dictates that to exclude such principles and values will affect behavior. Apparently it did. In fact, George Washington, in yet another remarkable insight from his excellent farewell address, accurately predicted what has now occurred.
Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert?
Washington warned that if the sense of religious obligation were separated from the public arena, that there would be no security for life or property, the very things most often touched by violent crime. In America, violent crime had remained stable for decades, but following the removal of religious principles, violent crime soared over 470%, with the United States becoming the world's leader in crimes committed. There are many additional examples of marked changes in national statistical measurements following 1962-63. Significantly, the founders understood that America could prosper only under God's blessings, and therefore refused to separate His principles from any aspect of public affairs. In fact, concerning God's blessings, Benjamin Franklin, right here in Independence Hall, reminded political leaders in his day,
"Without his concurring aid, we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages."
But the founders understood that in order for God to bestow His blessings, His principles first had to be honored and embraced. George Washington pointed out,
"The propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained."
In fact, the thought of disregarding what Washington had called God's eternal rules of order and right was a fearful thought for the Founding Fathers. As Thomas Jefferson acknowledged,
I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that His justice cannot sleep forever.
Of course, the founders' reasoning that God will bless or oppose a nation based on the policies it adopts makes sense only if there is a God, only if He has established transcendent rights and wrongs, and only if He responds to a nation on that basis. But if these ifs are true, then it goes a long way toward explaining the correlation so visible on the charts. Obviously, the founders certainly believed these ifs to be true, and they therefore repeatedly stressed that God should be openly and publicly acknowledged throughout the civic arena. For example, consider this document. This is the very first federal Thanksgiving proclamation, a proclamation written by President George Washington. In this document, Washington forcefully reminded Americans,
"It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor."
This is exactly what America did prior to 1962-63. Samuel Adams made a similar declaration.
May every citizen in the country have a proper sense of the deity upon his mind, and an impression of the declaration recorded in the Bible, "Him that honoreth me, I will honor, but he that despiseth me shall be lightly esteemed." 1 Samuel 2:30.
America long guided its public policy with a clear awareness of these principles, fully embracing the belief that when America honored God, God could bless America, but that if America adopted policies that despised God and His standards, His blessings should no longer be expected. This belief stemmed from the principle of national accountability to God. While this concept is not completely unknown today, it's the concept of individual accountability to God that's still widely accepted. Most people believe that someday they will stand before God and answer to Him for their behavior. However, the founders stressed both individual and national accountability, and they also understood a fundamental difference between the two, the difference of when that accountability would occur. They recognized that individuals would answer to God in the future, but that nations would not. That when a nation passed from existence, it was forever gone and would not be resurrected to answer for what it had done. So when does a nation answer to God? That question was answered right here in this room on the floor of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, when George Mason, known as the father of the Bill of Rights, reminded the other delegates,
As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities.
Other founders echoed the same truth. They believed that God would deal with the nation right now, in the present, for the stands that it takes and the policies it enacts. Understanding the profound consequences of national accountability, the founders were emphatic about keeping in public office those who would enact policies that God could bless. But leaders who honor God's principles are placed into office only when voters themselves first embrace those principles and then apply them as a standard to guide their vote. Therefore, if God-fearing citizens are not involved at the ballot box, then God-fearing leaders will not be elected to office, God-honoring policies will not be enacted, and the result is that the respective city or state or nation will not be blessed by God. This is why Chief Justice John Jay had reminded the voters in his day,
Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers.
In the same vein, the Reverend Charles Finney reminded Christian voters in his day,
The time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics. Christians have been exceedingly guilty in this manner, but the time has come when they must act differently. Christians seem to act as if they think God does not see what they do in politics, but I tell you, He does see it, and He will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics.
Of course, news reporting today rarely mentions whether a candidate running for office embraces or rejects God-fearing and biblical principles. And God-fearing citizens often complain that they don't know what a candidate really believes. Well, thankfully, there are now a number of voter websites available to help identify the specific beliefs of candidates on numbers of important issues, including those related to biblical values. Links to several such websites are available at www.wallbuilders.com. In addition, when a race has a state or a federal incumbent running for re-election, numerous websites will present the incumbent's voting record, clearly establishing what he's actually done while in office. And by the way, a voting record is always to be believed above a candidate's speeches or campaign ads, for as the old axiom correctly states, actions speak louder than words. God-fearing citizens must become active voters. They must also realize that separation of church and state as it exists today is not a teaching of the Founding Fathers, it is not an historical teaching, and it's not a teaching of law until recent years. While we fully support a separation between the two institutions of church and state, that does not mean a separation of values and principles and religious expressions from the public square. Furthermore, because of contemporary court rulings, we need to recognize that there is going to be someone's religion in the schools and in the government. With the courts having rejected traditional meanings, it's led to a number of absurd consequences. For generations, the understanding of what constituted a religion was simple and straightforward. By all definitions, to be a religion required a belief in some supreme being who set forth commands by which he expected his followers to live and conduct their affairs. That is, religion required a belief in the existence of some supreme being who was to be worshipped and obeyed by his followers. Consequently, the term religion could include those of the pagans, or Muslims, or Jews, or Hindus, or Christians, or many others. However, groups that did not acknowledge some type of supreme being were never considered to be religions. But in the early 1960s, when the court decided to change the long-standing meaning of the First Amendment, it also decided to change the long-standing meaning of religion. And just as it wrote its own new First Amendment, it also wrote its own new definition for religion. Under its new definition, a person's religion was whatever he believed so strongly that it affected the way he behaved. As a result, many beliefs and creeds and philosophies that completely denied the existence of any supreme being suddenly became legal religions. Consider a few absurd examples from the many that now exist. Courts now hold that atheism is a religion. But atheism is the essence of anti-religion, so how can anti-religion be a religion? What are the religious beliefs of atheists? Well, atheists believe devoutly that there should be no public religious expressions. So the religion of atheism is the religion of practicing no religious practice. That is, it is religiously practicing non-religion, and the courts now officially consider atheism to be a First Amendment religion entitled to full religious protections. Don't shake your head to clear it just yet. Courts and government officials have also ruled that satanic and Wiccan groups are now religious groups, and that people who give contributions to those groups may receive the same tax deductions as people who give contributions to Christian churches or Jewish synagogues. The courts also consider secular humanism to be a legitimate religion, equivalent under the law to Christianity. But what is the primary belief of the religion of secular humanism? It's the belief that everything revolves around man rather than God, It's a man-centered philosophy that excludes God. There is no belief in any kind of supreme being, yet this is a court-recognized religion. Scientology, begun in the 1950s, is also now an official religion. Its beliefs are simple. It says,
In Scientology, no one is asked to accept anything as belief or on faith. That which is true for you is what you have observed to be true.
The truth in this religion is whatever an individual personally picks and chooses to be true. Scientology is often described as a self-help philosophy. And even though there are dozens of other self-help philosophies and groups across the nation, this one calls itself a religion and thus secures additional court protections. And as a final example, Universalist Unitarianism, formed in 1961, is now recognized as a legal religion. Interestingly, this may be the most comprehensive religion in the world, for it has absolutely no fixed set of beliefs or doctrines. As it explains,
We believe that personal experience, conscience, and reason should be the final authorities in religion, and that in the end, religious authority lies not in a book or person or institution, but in ourselves. We are a non-creedal religion. We do not ask anyone to subscribe to a creed.
because the primary doctrine of this religion is that every individual may choose whatever he wants to believe, followers of this religion often hold diametrically opposite beliefs on the same issue. Nevertheless, both opposite beliefs are included as part of the official beliefs of this legal religion. Clearly, every individual in America, or for that matter in the world, could qualify to be part of this religion, for all have individual beliefs that stem from their own personal experience. Previously, the beliefs of all of these types of groups were protected by the First Amendment's Free Speech Clause, as well as its Assembly Clause, that is, the right of persons to assemble together. But these groups were not protected by the Constitution's religion clauses. Those clauses existed to protect the truly religious. But now, the constitutional protections for the truly religious have been expanded to include every individual, even the non- and the anti-religious, thereby eradicating the religious protections for the truly religious. Okay, so all of these beliefs and many others are now officially considered religions. That is, Christianity is a religion, as is secularism, atheism, universalism, Scientology, Satanism, and so on. They're all religions, but when is it that the cry of separation from church and state is heard? Are all these religions treated the same? Do social activists enter public schools at Halloween and demand, "Get those witches down off the walls. Witchcraft is a legal, organized religion recognized by the courts. I demand separation of church and state"? Or do they enter schools, look around, and then say, "I don't see any prayer here. I don't see any Bible reading here. As a matter of fact, I don't see any religious practice here"? That means the religion of atheism is being practiced here. The religion of secularism is established here. I demand separation of church and state. Get the religions of atheism and secular humanism out of the schools. Such demands are unknown. So when do we hear separation of church and state? We hear it any time that there's an attempt to involve Judeo-Christian but not other religious principles. That is, not at Halloween, but rather at Thanksgiving and Easter and Christmas. Clearly, there's a double standard. Today's separation of church and state only means that biblical principles must be kept out of public, but not the principles, beliefs, or practices of other religions, or even the so-called religions. Perhaps the clearest demonstration of this fact is evidenced by the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which has jurisdiction over 7 states and 54 million Americans. That federal court ruled that it was not constitutional for public school students to say, "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, but that it was constitutional for public schools to require a 3-week indoctrination to the Islamic faith in which junior high students must pretend that they're Muslims and they must offer prayers to Allah. Additionally, they're urged to take Islamic names, call each other by those names, wear Islamic garb, participate in jihad games, and read the Quran during those 3 weeks. Significantly, that federal court of appeals did not think that requiring Islamic religious activities violated the so-called separation of church and state, but they believed that voluntarily saying "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance did. Courts have also held that classroom libraries may include books on Eastern Oriental religions and Native American religions, but that they must remove books about Christianity. Islamic symbols may be publicly displayed at schools during Islamic holidays, but Christian symbols may not be displayed during Christian holidays. And schools may accommodate the distinct religious dress and clothing preferences of Muslim students, but not of Christian students. Because the courts now define religion to be whatever a person believes so strongly that it affects the way he behaves, the result is that there will never be a time when someone's religious beliefs will not be part of public policy. Therefore, the proper question is no longer whether religious beliefs will be part of public policy, but rather whose religious beliefs will be part of that policy. Will it be the religious beliefs of atheism, secularism, Islam, Eastern mysticism, universalism, self-help Scientology, or a plethora of other religions, creeds, and beliefs? Or will it be the Judeo-Christian religious beliefs upon which the nation was founded and which over 85% of Americans still embrace today? In short, separation of church and state as it exists today is not a teaching of the Founding Fathers or even a historical teaching, but it is the war cry of the modern secularist and anti-biblicist. In America, we've lost much ground in recent years as we've lost our understanding of our own history. We do have a godly heritage in America, but we've been robbed. Robbed by the 3%, by the secularists, and by what is often an all too willing group of public officials and judges who work to establish secularism across the nation. Significantly, however, there are many excellent God-fearing public officials and judges at all levels of government who do respect and who do work to protect our history and traditional values. But we as voters have become negligent in recent years, and by our own complacency and our own lack of investigation into the beliefs of candidates, we've allowed into public office too many who hold the opposite view. It's time that Americans relearn their own history and refamiliarize themselves with their own governing documents. As Chief Justice John Jay recommended,
every member of the state ought diligently to read and to study the Constitution of his country. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they are violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them.
it is also time for Americans to become re-engaged in the civil arena. As John Adams admonished,
we electors have an important constitutional power placed in our hands. It becomes necessary to every citizen, then, to be in some degree a statesman and to examine and judge for himself the political principles and measures. Let us examine them with a sober Christian spirit.
in short, it's time for Americans to recover the things we've given up in recent years. It's time to get involved.
Through Wallbuilders, you'll